On April 10, 1781, Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, a veteran of Minden and Wilhelmstal, a man who had never lost a major battle in the American South, was leading a hardened British-German army of thousands of professional soldiers toward the tobacco port of Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis expected a straightforward campaign. Dig in, wait for the Royal Navy, crush a rebellion that had already cost the Americans battle after battle. What Cornwallis marched into instead was a swamp, and something living inside it that no officer in his command had written into a single battle plan. By October, his army wasn't being beaten by Washington's cannons first. It was being beaten by something with no uniform, no flag, and no name any general of the era would have taken seriously. So how did a mosquito, an insect nobody in either army considered a combatant, help cripple one of the most experienced fighting forces Britain ever sent to America? To understand how strange this is, you have to understand how good Cornwallis's army was on paper. Through 1780 and early 1781, his forces had fought their way across the Carolinas, a win at Camden, a loss at Cowpens, a brutal, costly victory at Guilford Courthouse. This was not a green army. It was seasoned, disciplined, and led by a commander with a real Continental War record behind him. A man who'd earned his rank fighting on the open battlefields of Germany, not in the swamps of the American South. But something else had already been quietly grinding his numbers down. The year before Yorktown, mosquitoes had triggered a malaria epidemic in the British Army while it sat in South Carolina, sickening roughly half the force. A warning almost nobody outside the medical tents took seriously. By the time Cornwallis reached Virginia, he wasn't just managing an enemy army. He was managing an invisible one that had already cost him a war's worth of soldiers he'd never see fall in battle. Royal Governor Patrick Tonin of East Florida had already summed up the previous year's campaign in a letter to London, writing bluntly that sickness and disease had made more havoc among the king's troops than the sword ever had. That line wasn't written by some outside critic of the war. It was written by one of the men actually running it. The real protagonist of this story isn't a general, it's a mosquito. Specifically the females of a species called Anopheles quadrimaculatus, native to the marshes, tidal creeks, and standing water of the American Southeast. Its life cycle from egg to adult can take as little as 5 days in warm summer conditions, sometimes stretching to 2 weeks, meaning a single swampy encampment could produce new biting generations faster than most armies could rotate their sentries. Inside that mosquito rode a parasite, Plasmodium, the actual agent of malaria, picked up from one infected person and injected into the next. For most of the 18th century, nobody connected mosquitoes to fever at all. Malaria was blamed on bad air rising from swamps. The word malaria literally comes from the Italian for bad air. Doctors on both sides dismissed the insect itself as a nuisance, not a delivery system. An unnamed 18th century visitor to the Carolina Low Country reportedly summed up the region's brutal seasonal rhythm this way. Spring was described as a paradise, summer as something closer to hell, and autumn as one long hospital stay. Soldiers swatted mosquitoes off their necks for months without a single medical officer connecting the itching to the fever that followed weeks later. The insect was beneath notice, right up until it wasn't. Nobody in either army's medical corps had any real answer for it either. What passed for treatment was almost worse than the disease itself, and it applied equally to both sides whenever fever struck. Physicians drained blood, dosed patients with mercury, and in at least one documented case, strapped freshly killed pigeons to a feverish soldier's feet as a folk remedy. The one thing that reliably worked, powdered cinchona bark from South America, what soldiers sometimes just called Peruvian bark, existed and was even carried by some naval surgeons of the period, but its dosing was inconsistent and its distribution patchy. since the alkaloid inside it, quinine, wouldn't be chemically isolated and understood for another 40 years. Cornwallis himself understood something his superiors back in New York refused to fully weigh: that the ground his army stood on mattered as much as the ground it fought over. In a letter dated April 10, 1781, he wrote plainly that he wanted to move his troops to healthier upland terrain specifically to preserve them from the fatal sickness which so nearly ruined the army last autumn. He had lived through this once. He knew swampy lowland terrain in high summer wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a second front his men couldn't shoot back at. His commanding officer, Sir Henry Clinton, overruled him anyway, ordering him to fortify a deep water port for naval purposes instead. That port was Yorktown. Cornwallis had correctly diagnosed the danger months in advance, named it in his own handwriting, and was marched directly into it regardless, overruled not by an enemy general, but by his own side's confidence in a strategy that never accounted for what the swamp itself was capable of. There was no British general standing over a map plotting where to deploy a Mosquito. But there didn't need to be, because the terrain did the work for it. Yorktown sits on a bluff over the York River, ringed by tidal marsh, freshwater creeks, and vegetated pond margins, precisely the standing water habitat Anopheles quadrimaculatus needs to breed. Cornwallis fortified this position through midsummer 1781, packing thousands of British and German soldiers, most of them born and raised in Britain or the German states, with no childhood exposure to malaria and no inherited resistance to it, into close encampments, surrounded by exactly the breeding ground the parasite needed. Meanwhile, the Allied side was assembling from the opposite direction. Washington and Rochambeau marched their combined American and French forces south, arriving through September, while Admiral de Grasse sealed off the Chesapeake by sea, cutting off any hope of British reinforcement or evacuation. As the Allied army dug its own siege lines closer through late September and into October, trenches opening around October 6th, the two forces were, in effect, occupying the same patch of infected ground. But they weren't equally exposed to what was already spreading through it. American troops, many raised in the malarial South, carried a level of natural resistance built over a lifetime. The French had arrived too recently for the disease's roughly month-long incubation period to have caught up with them yet. Only the British and German troops dug into these lines for weeks longer, in higher concentration, with the least biological protection, sat squarely inside the Mosquito's kill zone, while nobody on either side had planned a single redoubt around that fact. Layer that timing on top of the geography, and the trap becomes almost mathematical. Malaria's incubation period in a newly bitten person runs roughly a month before symptoms appear. The French had only arrived from the north in late September. Run the calendar forward, and their exposure window simply hadn't matured by the time Cornwallis's surrender was already being negotiated in mid-October. The Americans, meanwhile, weren't protected by timing at all. Many of them carried a baseline resistance built from a lifetime spent in the same disease-endemic regions the British had only just marched into for the first time. Put those two protections side by side, inherited resistance on one flank, sheer timing on the other, and you get an Allied force that looked, on paper, no different from the British in terms of exposure to the same swamp, the same water, the same mosquitoes, and yet came through the siege almost entirely unaffected by the one enemy nobody had drawn on a map. Cornwallis had built his reputation the hard way, a commander who had never suffered a true rout in the South, a man Clinton trusted enough to send further from supply lines than almost any other British officer in America. That confidence was earned in the open field, against muskets and cannon, the kind of war Cornwallis had trained for since his 20s. It gave him no useful instinct for a fight against something that didn't announce itself with gunfire. His own letters make clear he saw the risk on paper months in advance, But the military culture around him treated fever season as an inconvenience to be endured, not a threat to be tactically countered. Yorktown was chosen for its harbor, not its health. And that decision rested on the assumption that a professional European army could simply out-discipline whatever the swamp threw at it. Through August and into September 1781, it happened quietly, one soldier at a time. A cold, uncontrollable shiver in the middle of a Virginia summer that no amount of piled-on clothing could shake off. Then, hours later, a burning fever with a racing pulse and a flushed, sweating face, cycling through repeated paroxysms until a man's strength simply gave out. A soldier too weak to stand his watch. Then another. Then entire companies reporting to the surgeon's tent instead of the trench line. American Army surgeon Dr. James Tilton, working the Allied camps that same season, later noted how comparatively rare sickness and desertion were among the French troops specifically. A detail that only makes sense once you know the French simply hadn't been in the swamp long enough yet for the parasite to catch up with them. Even amid the epidemic, care ran up the chain of rank first. Fellow physician Dr. James Craik, running the hospital at Yorktown, was specifically instructed to prioritize treatment for the Marquis de Lafayette above the ordinary soldiers filling the same wards. By the time the Allied second parallel of siege trenches closed in mid-October and American and French troops stormed redoubts 9 and 10 on October 14th, Cornwallis's garrison wasn't just under artillery fire, it was already collapsing from the inside. His own report to superiors stated his effective combat strength had been reduced to little more than 3,200 rank and file fit for duty, out of a garrison that had numbered as many as 7,000 to 9,000 men. Roughly half his army, by his own accounting, couldn't be put on the line at all. Across the field, less than 8% of the American army was reporting sick at the same moment. Sit with that exact number for a second, because historians studying this still double-check it. Roughly half of one of Britain's most experienced armies in America, some estimates run closer to 2/3, sidelined, not by musket fire, but by fever, while the army facing them across a few hundred yards of Virginia mud reported single-digit sickness. Same swamp, same air, same season, breathed by men standing at times only a few hundred yards apart. A difference that wide in the same square mile of ground sounds almost invented, until you remember one side grew up immune to a disease the other side had never met, and had no defense against beyond simply enduring it. This wasn't the only time it happened either. History has a near twin to this exact disaster. In 1809, a British expeditionary force of 39,000 men, the largest force Britain fielded that year, bigger than the army then fighting Napoleon in Spain, landed on the swampy Dutch island of Walcheren. Only 106 of them died in combat. Roughly 4,000 died of fever, and another 12,000 were permanently invalided by it. A warning about that exact island's disease risk that had existed for decades and been ignored. Just like Cornwallis's own warning about Yorktown had been. 2 empires, 2 swamps, 2 commanders who saw the danger coming and were sent forward regardless. If a story like this is new to you, a war decided as much by biology as by bayonets, we cover forgotten weapons and overlooked tactical turning points like this every week, so it's worth sticking around for what's next. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered roughly 7,000 men at Yorktown and didn't attend the ceremony himself. He sent Brigadier General Charles O'Hara in his place, citing illness. When O'Hara tried to hand his sword to Rochambeau, the French commander redirected him to Washington, who refused to accept a surrender from anyone but Cornwallis and had O'Hara yield instead to General Benjamin Lincoln. The same sickness that had spent 2 months quietly dismantling the British Army from the inside may have kept its own commander off the field on the day the war effectively ended. The surrender at Yorktown pushed Britain to the negotiating table and effectively ended major fighting in the Revolution. But the disease story didn't end there either. A 2025 peer-reviewed paper by military medicine researcher Dennis Shanks drew a direct line from 1781 to a second, near-identical disaster on that exact same patch of Virginia Peninsula 81 years later, when Union General McClellan's army stalled in the Chickahominy swamps during the 1862 Civil War Peninsula Campaign and suffered its own malaria epidemic. Same stretch of Virginia riverbank, same species of mosquito, same underlying mistake of camping an army in the wrong ground at the wrong time of year, 8 decades apart. The paper's real point isn't that mosquitoes single-handedly won the revolution. It's more careful than that. Disease didn't decide the outcome alone, but it decided how many soldiers Cornwallis actually had left to make his own decisions with. Today, the earthworks, redoubts 9 and 10, and Surrender Field itself are preserved inside Colonial National Historical Park. Quiet grass and marked trenches where thousands of men once collapsed from a fever nobody in either uniform fully understood. Local tradition still points visitors toward Cornwallis's Cave along the riverbank as his supposed headquarters during the siege, though the historical record actually places him in a bunker further inland near Tobacco Road, a small reminder of how much folklore has layered itself over the documented facts of this particular battle. The lesson underneath all of it is a simple one, and it isn't really about mosquitoes at all. The side that trusts its own strength the most is often the side that stopped looking for the threat it can't see coming. An army built to win open-field battles against muskets and cannon had no doctrine at all for an opponent that didn't carry a weapon, wear a uniform, or show up on a scouting report. Cornwallis saw this one coming, in writing, months in advance, naming the exact danger by name and asking for the one thing that might have blunted it, and was overruled and marched into it anyway. Sometimes the side that loses isn't the side that failed to see the trap. It's the side that saw it clearly, said so in writing, and was ordered forward regardless.